Ava Jennings was 15 when she vanished, young enough to still wear glitter nail polish, old enough to crave independence. It was a Wednesday night in the summer of 2003, and she had just finished her shift at Burger Stop on Willow Creek Road, a forgettable fast food joint on the edge of town where she worked part-time to save for her learner's permit. Her co-workers remembered her laughing that day, flipping fries and humming along to the radio. At 9:06 p.m., she was seen walking out the back door with a trash bag slung over her shoulder, heading toward the dumpsters. She never returned. Her purse and Nokia phone were found untouched in her locker. Her apron was folded neatly on the break room bench. The security footage glitched at the exact moment she stepped outside, cutting to static, then resuming 5 minutes later as if nothing had happened. No screams, no struggle, just a 15-year-old girl swallowed whole by the dark. Police searched the woods behind the restaurant, questioned co-workers, scoured nearby alleys, but nothing came of it. Ava's face appeared on flyers, milk cartons, and local news channels for weeks, her soft brown eyes and timid smile becoming a haunting fixture of the town's grief. Some said she ran away. Others whispered about a boyfriend no one had met. Her mother never believed either. She insisted Ava wouldn't just disappear, not without a fight, not without a message. But time moved on. Leads dried up. The restaurant stayed open, still serving fries beneath flickering lights and ceiling tiles stained with grease. Eventually, the flyers were taken down, the case shelved as cold, and the world forgot Ava Jennings, except her mother, who never stopped watching that back door in her nightmares, and the building, which stood silent and untouched, as if it too knew the truth had never really left. It had just been hidden, somewhere behind the grease traps and stainless steel. What happened next will shock you. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. Grief doesn't knock when it enters a home. It kicks the door in and stays until everything inside is unrecognizable. For Diane and Marcus Jennings, Ava's disappearance wasn't just the loss of a daughter. It was the slow unraveling of everything that once held them together. Diane became a fixture in town, handing out flyers long after the ink had faded, calling into radio stations, posting in online forums under usernames that all bore her daughter's name. She kept Ava's room untouched, dusting her trophies, folding her bedspread, whispering goodnight as if the walls could still hear. Marcus, on the other hand, shrank from the noise of hope. He stopped sleeping, stopped talking. He'd sit in the garage for hours, staring at the door as if Ava might walk through it any second. But she never did, and eventually, neither did he. One spring morning in 2005, he packed a single duffel and left without a goodbye, unable to keep living in a house where time had frozen and guilt had taken root. The town, once ignited by outrage and candlelight vigils, slowly dimmed. Neighbors stopped asking. The headlines thinned. Ava's case file was moved to the bottom drawer. The Burger Stop, now ghosted by both employees and customers, limped along until health violations shut its doors for good. The final nail was quiet. No announcement, just a rusting chain on the front door and a sign that read, "Closed for renovation," that never changed. Nature crept in. Vines curled through the cracks in the windows. Rats made nests in the fryer vents. Teenagers dared each other to break in and swore they heard whispers in the freezer. And through it all, Diane watched. Not the building, but what it represented. The last place her daughter was ever seen. She passed it every week, slowing down but never stopping, because stopping would mean accepting what everyone else already had, that Ava was never coming home. But Diane couldn't. wouldn't, because the story wasn't over. Not yet. Not while that building still stood like a sealed casket waiting to be opened. 2 decades after Ava Jennings vanished behind the back door of Burger Stop, the building still stood like a mausoleum, quiet, sagging, and forgotten by time. That changed in the spring of 2023 when a regional franchise owner named Sean Delaney purchased the lot with plans to turn it into a sleek, modern bistro. He saw potential in the location, not the history, and brought in a crew to gut the place from the inside out. For weeks, contractors ripped out old booths, tore down grease-slicked tiles, and scraped years of grime off walls that hadn't seen sunlight since flip phones were cutting edge. But it was during the demolition of the kitchen that something strange emerged. One of the crew, a man named Eric, noticed a section of the back wall that didn't match the blueprints. It was newer, less weathered, like someone had added it after the restaurant was built. Curious, the team began to tear it down. Behind the false panel was a sealed industrial freezer, bolted shut and framed into place with hastily poured concrete. No one on site had seen anything like it. And when the locks were finally broken and the door wrenched open, the air that poured out was thick, sour, and suffocating. The crew stumbled back, gagging, eyes burning. What they saw inside turned stomachs and silenced the room. A tangle of cloth, matted hair, and bones resting in a fetal position, still wearing what looked like the remnants of a fast food uniform. Time had ravaged the body, but not enough to erase the truth. Whoever had been left in there had not wandered in by accident. The freezer hadn't failed. It had been sealed, hidden, entombed. Police arrived within the hour, their faces pale as they stepped into the chilling dark of that space. The site was immediately shut down, the renovation halted, and for the first time in 20 years, Ava Jennings's name was spoken not in whispers, but with urgency. The restaurant wasn't just being remodeled, it was revealing secrets it had held in silence. Secrets that screamed the truth had always been buried just behind the wall. The call came in just after midnight, waking Diane from a sleep she hadn't known how to fall into for years. On the other end of the line was a voice too calm for what it was about to say. The forensic team had finished their preliminary analysis of the remains found in the hidden freezer, and the DNA results were conclusive. It was Ava. Her avenue. Diane didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply pressed the phone to her chest and stared at the ceiling in silence, as if waiting for her heart to register that the search was finally over. At the morgue, they let her see what was left. Brittle bones, matted strands of the same honey-brown hair Diane used to braid, the faded uniform shirt with her daughter's name still stitched to the pocket. Tucked beneath the collar was a silver ring Ava had once stolen from her mother's jewelry box and never gave back. That, more than anything, confirmed it. News spread like wildfire. Local headlines gave way to national attention. The town that had buried Ava's memory now stood in stunned disbelief, reckoning with the fact that she had never left the building at all. She hadn't run away. She hadn't been kidnapped and whisked into the night. She had been hidden, boxed in and forgotten, beneath their noses. Former employees came forward, sick with guilt for the nights they mopped those floors without knowing what was just beyond the wall. Some cried on camera. Others stayed off the record, ashamed. The police reopened the case with full force, treating it now not as a disappearance, but as a homicide that had been carefully staged to look like an escape. Diane, for all the agony in her eyes, found a terrible kind of validation. She had always said Ava didn't run. Now she had proof. Proof wrapped in a freezer's silence. The town watched her stand at the caution tape, unmoved, unmoving, the wind tugging gently at her sleeves as if even the air around her knew something sacred had just been unearthed. The truth hadn't rotted. It had waited. Carl Benson had always seemed like the kind of man who kept things running smoothly, punctual, polite, the sort who wore too much cologne and called the teenage employees kiddo with a grin that never quite reached his eyes. His personnel file from the burger stop read like a manager's dream. No write-ups, no tardies, quarterly bonuses, even a commendation for exemplary leadership under pressure the month after Ava vanished. But when detectives started digging, the cracks weren't in his paperwork. They were in the whispers that never made it into ink. Former workers, now adults with children of their own, recalled uneasy memories. Being asked to stay late alone, doors locked during inventory checks, questions that didn't feel right coming from a boss. One girl remembered how Carl once followed her into the freezer to check the thermostat, then stood too close when she tried to leave. At the time, it felt like nothing she could prove. Now, those memories were bricks in a wall that painted Carl not as a model employee, but as a man who understood how to stay invisible. And invisible he became. Records showed he left town in early 2004, just months after the restaurant was shut down for minor health violations. He'd told co-workers he was moving to care for his mother in Ohio. But there was no mother, no forwarding address. What there was instead, police would soon discover, was a string of low-level food service jobs scattered across 5 states, each time under a slightly altered name: Ben Carlson, Charles Benson, Carl B. Weston. The pattern was deliberate, and it led investigators to a rural diner in Montana where a man with tired eyes and a too-straight posture worked the late shift, always alone. When they showed him a photo of Ava, he blinked once, slowly, then asked if he could finish his cigarette first. That was when they knew they had him, not just the man, but the monster buried beneath layers of polite smiles and forged pay stubs. The truth was never far. It had just worn a name tag. The freezer had given them Ava's remains, but it was the wall behind it that gave them the full horror of her final hours. As investigators dismantled the hidden paneling, their flashlights caught the edge of something that shouldn't have been there. Another barrier, drywall unevenly patched, masking a shallow cavity carved into the back of the building like a secret no one was ever meant to find. Inside was a narrow, suffocating space barely large enough to stand in. The air was thick with rot and mildew, and what lay within turned hardened crime scene techs quiet. A stained mattress slumped against one wall, its springs broken and fabric matted with grime. A length of frayed rope lay curled beside it, next to fast food wrappers dated from the very week Ava vanished. A small, broken camera sat atop a milk crate, its viewfinder cracked but still clutching film, undeveloped, decaying, but miraculously intact. Forensics handled it like glass. When the photos came back, no one was ready. Most were blurry, distorted angles, low light, half shapes, but one strip was sharp enough to silence the entire department. Ava, crouched in the corner of that same room, her eyes glassy with fear, still in uniform, the name tag just legible beneath a smear of dust. The timestamp on the photo confirmed the unthinkable. Ava had still been alive hours after her shift was supposed to end. Whatever had happened in that room hadn't been instant. It had been drawn out, deliberate. The images weren't just evidence, they were a scream frozen in time, the final echo of a girl who had been left to vanish, not into the night, but into the walls of her own workplace. The room hadn't been a panic move. It had been prepared, used, and sealed like a tomb. It told a story no one wanted to believe. That Ava Jennings wasn't stolen by some stranger in the dark. She had been hidden just feet away, behind the humming freezer, while the fryers still sizzled and customers asked for extra ketchup. Carl Benson was living in a one-bedroom trailer on the outskirts of a wind-beaten Montana town, going by the name Dennis Cole. He kept to himself, worked the graveyard shift at a roadside diner, and paid in cash whenever he could. His hair was grayer, and the weight of the years had softened the sharpness of his jawline. But when detectives showed up at his door, his eyes were exactly the same. Cold, calculating, too still for a man surprised. He didn't run, didn't protest, just raised his hands and said, "I figured you'd come eventually." At the station, it took hours before he spoke. He asked for coffee, then silence, then finally broke down when they laid the Polaroids across the metal table, one by one. That's when the dam cracked. He admitted it wasn't the first time he'd crossed a line with the girls who worked under him, but Ava was different, bright, kind, and unafraid to speak up. She caught him in the office with a hidden camera, one he had aimed at the employee bathroom. She threatened to tell. Not to yell or fight, but to quietly, firmly report him. That terrified him more than anything. He claimed it was panic, a split-second mistake, that he'd only meant to lock her in the freezer until she calmed down, until he figured out what to do. But when he returned, hours later, she had stopped screaming. He said he didn't know what to do with a body, so he built a wall, poured quick-dry concrete, and sealed the freezer like it was just another piece of broken equipment. Then he scrubbed the schedules, cleared her locker, and played the grieving manager until the press left. When asked why he stayed in food service for 20 more years, his answer was flat. People don't look too closely in restaurants. The room went quiet after that. His confession wasn't laced with remorse, only exhaustion. Like he'd been holding his breath for 20 years and was finally ready to exhale. But for the people in that room, and for the girl frozen in a hidden box, the damage had already been done. The courthouse smelled faintly of bleach and old wood, but beneath that was something heavier. Anticipation, grief, the weight of 2 decades compacted into one room. Seats were filled by faces both familiar and forgotten. Former co-workers with creased brows, aging locals who once shook their heads at the missing posters, and parents gripping each other's hands like lifelines. But none carried the storm like Diane Jennings, who sat at the front, eyes locked on the man who stole her daughter and lived like it never happened. Carl Benson wore a plain suit and a hollow expression, like a man already half erased. When Diane took the stand, her voice trembled but never cracked as she recounted the nights spent staring at Ava's empty bed, the birthdays marked with silence, the dreams where her daughter whispered from behind walls. Then came the other voices, women now in their 30s who once folded napkins and wiped tables under Carl's supervision. They told stories that had once seemed minor, the odd requests, the too long glances, the sudden schedule changes that left them alone with him late at night. On their own, they were warnings. Together, they became a pattern. The prosecutor laid it out piece by piece, the camera, the room, the photographs, and when those Polaroids were passed to the jury, the entire room held its breath. The grainy snapshots of Ava, pale and shaking in that dark space, carried more weight than any testimony. Jurors stared in silence, some blinking back tears, others clenching their fists. Even the judge had to pause, letting the images hang in the air like ghosts. Carl never looked up. Not when the evidence was read. Not when Diane wept. Not even when the camera flashed, capturing the moment his past caught up with him. The trial wasn't just about justice. It was a reckoning, long overdue and painfully precise. Every detail that had been buried behind drywall was now laid bare beneath courtroom lights, and for the first time since Ava's disappearance, the truth had a voice louder than the silence Carl had left behind. When the jury returned after just 4 hours of deliberation, the courtroom barely breathed. Carl sat motionless, eyes fixed on a scuff in the floor beneath the defense table, as if detachment might soften the blow that had been 20 years in the making. The foreman rose, hands trembling slightly, and read the verdict aloud. Guilty on every count. Murder, kidnapping, unlawful confinement. The list was long, brutal, and damning. A gasp swept through the gallery, followed by the sound of Diane Jennings weeping softly into her palms, not out of joy, but release, the kind that comes when the truth is finally too loud to be ignored. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning storms, and reporters jostled for angles. But the story didn't end with Carl's handcuffs. It widened. Days later, the fast food corporation that once owned the Burger Stop chain faced a massive civil suit spearheaded by Diane and backed by a growing crowd of former employees and advocacy groups. Emails surfaced, buried complaints from teen workers, quiet settlements, training memos that emphasized speed over safety. What had once been dismissed as isolated bad apples now looked like a systemic rot, hidden behind smiling mascots and discount meal deals. Ava's name became a rallying cry. Legislators introduced new bills aimed at strengthening protections for teen workers, demanding stricter background checks and mandatory dual supervision rules for after-dark shifts. Her story led nightly news cycles, not as a tragedy but as a warning that silence in the workplace breeds monsters. School counselors hung her photo in hallways next to posters about speaking up. Parents told their children her story before their first job interviews. What Carl tried to bury became something no one could ignore, a cracked foundation beneath America's shiny fast food empire. And through it all, Diane Jennings walked quietly, never asking to be a hero, only a mother who refused to forget. The world had failed Ava once. Now, in her name, it was trying to do better. They came not with balloons or headlines this time, but with flowers, quietly, reverently, as the town gathered for the funeral that should have happened 20 years earlier. Ava Jennings, once just a name on a missing poster, was finally laid to rest beneath an open sky and a headstone etched with more than just dates. It read, "She was loved. She was brave. She is not forgotten." People who hadn't spoken her name in decades whispered it now like a prayer, lining the path to the cemetery with candles and snapshots of a girl frozen in time, bright-eyed, full of life, a flash of hope in a uniform that had become a symbol of something far darker. Diane Jennings stood at the front, her shoulders straight despite the weight of the years, and thanked them all, not for their sympathy, but for finally seeing her daughter, not as a footnote in a cold case file, but as a life that mattered. The foundation she launched in Ava's name focused on workplace safety for minors, pledging grants to schools and training centers across the country. It became her new mission, a way to pour grief into something that might spare another family the silence she endured. The building where Ava vanished was torn down days after the trial, its bricks falling like exhaled lies. In its place rose a memorial garden, simple but striking, flower beds where the freezer once stood, a winding stone path lined with names of other missing children, and a single bronze bench bearing Ava's favorite quote, "Even the smallest light breaks the dark." Diane visits it often, sitting where once there was only rot and ruin, now replaced by blooming lilies and quiet reflection. The pain is still there, it always will be, but the silence isn't. Not anymore. The story that was once buried behind concrete now lives in classrooms, in policy, in whispered warnings passed between parents and children, and in the rustling wind that moves through the trees above her daughter's grave, Diane hears something new. Not sorrow, not rage, but peace. The truth had been buried, but it refused to stay that way. Ava had finally been heard.